I have the very, very happy, I'm in a happy position because I get to recognize a leader in our industry and in the Bay Area. From our panels this morning, we clearly understand that all of us who are privileged to live and work in the San Francisco Bay Area have inherited an extraordinary maritime, industrial, and environmental legacy from visionary leaders who came before us. Frank C. Berger, one of the founding directors and chairman of the Bay Planning Coalition, helped to create that legacy through his leadership at the Army Corps of Engineers, at BCDC, and at the Northern California Ports and Terminal Bureau, among other organizations. Every year at the annual Decision Makers Conference, the board and officers of the Bay Planning Coalition select a regional leader who best exemplifies Frank Berger's legacy of vision, environmental protection, and economic progress. This year's honoree is Jack Broadbent. Jack is the Chief Executive Officer and Air Pollution Control Officer for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, our regional air quality agency. In this role, Jack leads the district's programs to achieve and maintain healthy air quality for our 9-county Bay Area district and its close to 8 million residents. On a professional note, in my role at the Port of Oakland as Environmental Programs and Planning Director, I've had the distinct pleasure of working closely with Jack and his talented staff at the Air District to reduce emissions at the Port of Oakland with a focus on maritime mobile emissions on behalf of improving public health, especially in the most vulnerable communities in our region. This partnership most recently has resulted in an over 71% reduction in diesel particulate matter emissions at the Port of Oakland in 2 years. 85 towards our 85% emission reduction goal. And this is in no short measure due to the tremendous effort and focus of Jack Broadbent and his staff. I can personally attest through this partnership that I've witnessed Jack's clear vision, fierce commitment to improving air quality, and talented leadership in serving the region and the economy, and to grow it in a sustainable and balanced manner. Please join me in recognizing Jack Broadbent as this year's 2015 recipient of the Frank Berger Award. And let me just read the award itself. Bay Planning Coalition Frank Berger Award in appreciation to Jack Broadbent, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, for work in bringing diverse interests together to advance environmental protection and economic vitality in the San Francisco Bay Delta community. Congratulations, Jack.
Thank you. Say a few words?
Yes.
Okay.
Jack will now say a few words.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Richard. I'm very honored to be able to receive the Frank Berger Award. I want to first start off by expressing my heartfelt thanks and sincere appreciation to John Coleman, Richard Sinkoff, and the Bay Planning Coalition for this recognition. This award is especially important to me personally in that it recognizes some of the key tenets of my work in environmental management. First, I believe that we need to have a balanced approach when it comes to environmental management and policy making. And this is despite Mr. Saby's remarks at the panel beforehand on our CEQA guidelines. I do strongly believe that environmental management and economic development need to go hand in hand. I also believe very strongly that all voices and perspectives need to be heard and considered in the final decision making. I've had the privilege of working in environmental management for over 32 years. I've always held very strongly the belief that the public is best served when environmental management can be done in coordination with economic development. This approach has served us very well in the Bay Area, and through our programs and working with the business community, with the environmental and public groups, we now enjoy some of the cleanest air we've here in the Bay Area over the last 50 years. Since the Air Districts was formed some 60 years ago this year, the region's population has more than doubled and the economic output has grown several-fold. Through working together, we are now in compliance, or will shortly be in compliance, with nearly all the federal ambient air quality standards here in the Bay Area. And that's something I think that all of us should take pride in. I also strongly believe that the public is best served when we take a collaborative process, and that all voices need to be considered when we are developing proposals to move forward. This approach has been instrumental in the development and implementation of the Port's Maritime Air Quality Improvement Plan, and I want to specifically recognize the Port of Oakland's leadership in this effort. Through that plan and through the district's subsequent actions, we've been able to basically clean up all the trucks servicing the Port of Oakland. We've been able to electrify the berths in the Port of Oakland itself as well as other ports in and around the Bay Area. And that has reduced diesel particulate levels in West Oakland by more than half. So essentially the residents of West Oakland who are most affected breathe now particulate levels that are more than half than they were just 4 or 5 years ago. And that's really due to the collaborative effort between the district, the Port of Oakland, the residents, the community groups, all of us working together. Now, there's clearly more that needs to be done. We still have high levels of particulate levels in and around certain communities, but I think building on our successful approach, wherein that we have all voices heard, we work collaboratively together, I believe strongly that we should use this approach and be able to secure our fair share of the state's cap and trade dollars to help invest in future programs here at the port and all maritime activities in and around the Bay Area. And I think that's really where we need to focus, and that's be able to garner our fair share of those resources to be able to allow us all to breathe clean air. So with those remarks, Richard, I do very much appreciate the recognition. This is heartfelt on my behalf. I just want to thank the Bay Planning Coalition for your recognition of both my efforts and my staff's. I'm here joined by a number of Air Quality District staff, so thank you, and thank you very much. Thank you.
In his service in the state legislature as insurance commissioner, lieutenant governor, and then he's been a member of Congress as well, serving on the House Armed Services Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure, and Agricultural Committee. He represents District 3, and he was raised and raises his family in McCullough Hill in Calaveras County, and well-known area to some of us here. Mr. Garamendi has been a true advocate on many issues for Californians in his long-term service. And it's great pleasure to indeed introduce and have Mr. Garamendi up here today. Thank you.
John, thank you very, very much. Eric, thanks for giving me a little leeway here. Going to be one of those busy afternoons. It's good to be back. It's really good to be back here. I was here last year. We talked about some of the things that are going on, and just in case you hadn't noticed, things are still going on. A lot of things happening. I sat down, tried to get that salad down very quickly, and really going to miss the chicken, but I'll probably have that later tonight. A lot of things to talk about. I was just picked up this marvelous little program here for the day, and I was thumbing through it and I go, Northern California economy. Then over here it has the ports, and it has the importance of... Anybody interested in San Francisco Bay around here? We ought to talk about it. We ought to talk about how really, really important this place is. And we usually think of it as, a tourist thing. You see it on television, somebody, a talking head with the Bay Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge behind you in the fog and all of that. Yeah, that's a piece of this puzzle. Certainly the tourism, everybody wants to go see the cable cars. Everybody wants to see the bay. And maybe even go up to Marin County and enjoy the pleasures there and further north in Napa. And I get that all the time. But not many people are focused on the extraordinary economic activity that this bay, I mean the water, provides for California and beyond. You go back into the history, and we see this the gold rush and the ships that are abandoned and the people that have left to head up towards my place where I was born. My family came there in the 1860s, right through here. They came on a steamer from, steamer or whatever it was, from Panama, where they crossed by mule, and came into this bay. And then went up to the mountains to look for gold, and they're still looking. They found a lot of rock. Had to get into the cattle business to survive. But this bay, back then and to this day, is the economic center of gravity for this area. I know we think about Silicon Valley and all that it brings, and it brings everything, as does the biotech industry. And probably it is still one of the major economic engines. But this little report says something in addition to it. And that is that this bay, the water and the ports and the economic activity surrounding it, and I would add the tourism surrounding it. Wasn't there a race here on this bay a year ago? What was that all about? A lot of economic activity here. How can we make it even more? What can we do? And that's what the Bay Planning Coalition is all about. Delighted to see the Air Quality District, Air Quality Management District, being recognized for the work it does. Not an easy task, but nonetheless absolutely essential. Which brings me to something that the future holds for this bay and for the air quality throughout here. Anybody, what's going on April 18th? Anybody know what's happening April 18th? San Diego, a hint. LNG. An earthquake in San Diego? I don't think so. No, LNG, the first LNG-powered ship to come off the shipyards in San Diego is going to get christened in San Diego on April 18th. What does that mean? It means somebody's looking to the future. It means that the air quality management districts up and down the state and north of here have pushed the technology into place being built here in California. And it's going to make a big difference here in San Francisco Bay and beyond. To technology changes and the recognition today of the Air Quality Management District, right on point. Would they be building this ship in San Diego if it were not for the requirement of air quality? Probably not, but they are. And there's more to come. And I really want to focus on two things. First of all, the ports in this entire region, really throughout the United States, have an enormous challenge. I spent a week, 3 days in Panama City with a conference on the Panama Canal, the new canal, what it means up and down the ports of America, and what it means for California. What it means for California is we need to do things here to better equip ourselves to maintain our prominence as the import-export on the Pacific coast. We got our hands full. We got things to do. How can we do it? We can do it with smart legislation, such as legislation that Congresswoman Hahn is or has, depending on which day you're talking about, introduced to make sure that the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund is actually spent on, not the general fund of the United States, but rather on harbor maintenance. And we're talking about a lot of dollars here. As ranking member of the Coast Guard Maritime Subcommittee of the Transportation Committee, I can say I had a little bit to do with that, and I'll certainly be working with her as a co-author to make certain that that actually becomes law, that we pry away from the greedy folks that do everything else that this nation needs to do and say, wait a minute, that money is really designated originally and should be used for what is one of the principal economic opportunities that this nation has, and that is our ports. And we've got to do it. We've got to make sure that we are actually all around this nation, and certainly here in the Bay Area, making sure that our ports are the most modern, the most efficient, and the most effective anywhere in the world. Otherwise, that Panama Canal expansion is going to be a real threat. Doesn't have to be, but it could be. And we need to do what we must do to make sure that we do that. That piece of legislation and the momentum behind it to bring that money back for its intended purpose is absolutely critical. There are a lot of other little things going on. This is really for more the Port of Charleston, but we're going to spend nearly $500 million on a facility in South Carolina to dispose of the unused surplus plutonium that we have, about 43 tons of it. It doesn't work. But yet we're going to continue to pour money down that rat hole, and I'm now working with the Appropriations Committee saying, let's take that money and use it for the ports and the maintenance of the ports, because it is in the same category as the Army Corps of Engineers category of funding. So we can shift this money around. So we need to make smart decisions on the overall budget, not just the kind of harbor maintenance tax, but also on these other things. What's it mean? It means a few $100 million that we can then use to grow our economy, to grow our transportation systems. Another thing that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, or should, is a renewal of the surface transportation programs. Now, the President has proposed a new version of last year's Grow America Act. We call it Grow America Act 2. Essentially the same general design, but it has $478 billion over 6 years, which on average that 6 years will be about $25 billion more for transportation programs of all kinds, one of which is absolutely critical for you who care about the economy of a place like San Francisco Bay. And that is the freight element in that bill. It is a very robust, it is a very comprehensive freight management plan for the United States. And it coordinates and brings money for all of the elements, the ports, the airports, the railroads, the trucking depots, all of those things, puts it together so that we can, for the first time in a comprehensive way for this entire nation, think about freight movement in a coordinated fashion, using the federal government program, in this case, hopefully the Grow America Act, or whatever you want to call it, that provides this kind of comprehensive funding and organization for the management of the movement of freight. Is it important to the Port of Oakland? Where did you go? You were around here someplace. The question and the answer is, of course. Absolutely essential. Now, there's one other thing that we've been working on, and that is the shipbuilding industry in this nation, while busy right now building a lot of smaller things, but important, like barges, like river boats and other ships that are used on rivers. All of those things are going on, and even some intercoastal work. But we're not building big ships in America except for the U.S. Navy. Now, the shipyards that build for the U.S. Navy are absolutely critical for the security of this nation. They are one of our strategic national assets. The other strategic national assets, what I spend a lot of time worrying about, is the merchant marine. America's ships, those ships that are built in America, those ships that are flagged in America and manned by American women and men. That merchant marine sector of this national security thing we ought to be paying attention to is rapidly diminishing. And a continuation of it is a very serious national security problem. We don't move much in terms of quantity on airplanes. I represent Travis and spent an hour there with the colonel this morning. But nonetheless, high value, okay, we'll put it on an airplane. But about 90% of all the military equipment and supplies travel on the water. on American ships, on American sailors, and it's rapidly diminishing. That's the second national security issue. The third national security issue is something that has happened in America over the last 7, 8, 10 years, and that is domestic energy supplies, specifically natural gas. It has allowed the industries in this nation to rebuild themselves. You want to talk to Dow Chemical? You want to talk to what they're doing out at Pittsburgh in their plant? Multi-million-dollar or multi-tens of million dollars investment expanding that plant because of the availability of natural gas at about 40% of the cost of that natural gas in Europe or Asia. It is an extremely important part of our national energy present and future, and it too is a strategic national asset. Now, what if we were to combine those three strategic national assets and recognize that the export of LNG, liquefied natural gas, provides us with a unique opportunity to rebuild the American shipbuilding industry and the American merchant marine. If we wrote 16 lines of law, that's all, 16 lines of law, and simply required that the export of this strategic asset be on American-built ships, American-flagged, and American sailors, we would rebuild the American commercial shipbuilding industry in this nation in a big way, in a huge way, and it can be done. "16 lines of law. The Cheniere liquefied natural gas facility in Louisiana will require 100 tankers to meet the full export potential of that one facility. 4 other, maybe 5 others, export facilities have been licensed and they're in the process of going through the various reviews that are necessary. As you can imagine, they're likely to be smaller than the Cheniere facility. As you can kind of get a sense of the potential that lies here. What could we do if we wanted to, as this nation, rebuild the American shipbuilding industry? What would we do? We'd write 16 lines of law. And we simply say, it's going to be done on American ships. Would our competitors scream and yell? Of course. But we can just let it roll off our backs. Is it a WTO problem? No, it's not. Pay attention to how I said this is a strategic national security issue. And then read the WTO. We could do this. What does it mean for the Bay Area? I don't know. Where are the entrepreneurs around here that want a piece of that action? Where are the men and women that can say, we could build things here. Maybe we can even build the ships here. We have the potential. We certainly can see them being built in San Diego. This is a Jones Act issue also, and those who want to do away with the Jones Act are not thinking seriously about this nation's economic and national security. If they were, they wouldn't be pushing to do away with the Jones Act. It's critical for this nation's national security and certainly critical for our economy. Now, we're going to get this done. It turns out that a lot of the shipyards are in districts represented by my new Republican friends. And guess what their interest is? They said, you mean we could do this? I said, yeah, we could do this. And there's also, I know, there's 1 or 2 oil companies here today. I'm not sure that they, but I do know the oil industry is interested in changing a current law that restricts the export of crude oil. Is it a good thing to restrict the export of, or to lift the restriction? Maybe yes, maybe no. We'll let you have your own opinion. But I've got an opinion. If we are to lift the export or the restriction on the export of crude oil, I'm going, What's the deal, folks? Do it on American-built ships with American sailors. What does that mean for our economy? It means that a very significant part of the American economy suddenly has the opportunity to blossom and grow. It means that we can revitalize not just the shipyards, but that entire supply train. All of the electronics, all of the running gear, all that engines, and on and on and on. This is a possibility. And all we need to do is to be wise about how we structure the laws and the requirements of this nation. Recognize that the rest of the world does precisely what I am suggesting America do. They protect their industries. They give their industries an advantage in many different ways. The shipbuilders in Singapore, the shipbuilders in China, Korea, all have national subsidies in one way or another. We're not asking for a subsidy. We're simply saying, we're going to build it in America. We're going to make it in America, and we're going to build the American economy, one ship, two ships, 100 ships at a time. This is a real possibility. We've got a lot of work to do. A lot of legislation's coming down. I see my friends over there with the Coast Guard. And yes, we're going to renew the Coast Guard authorization this year, and we're going to do our darndest to see that the Coast Guard actually has 2 heavy icebreakers so that we can play our role in the Arctic Ocean, which has now become the Northwest Passage. We can do that. Is it going to be expensive? Not nearly as expensive as relying upon the Russian icebreakers, who are giving Russia the first opportunity to use the Northwest Passage, which it will actually be along the coast of Russia. And we are nowhere presently. We can't let that happen. And there are a lot of other issues out there, and we're going to go at them. What I need from all of you, I need your interest and I need your support in building the American shipbuilding industry and building our American maritime industry. So any of you that are interested in joining in this effort, let me know. In the meantime, it's a pleasure to be with you. Look forward to working with any and all of you on any set of these issues having to do with our ports. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Garamendi. When you have the bill drafted, we look forward to working with you on that to make sure that we're protecting our interests here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We also have another slight adjustment in our schedule. That's what conferences are for, to make changes, and we're doing just that. We're also very honored to have, for the first time ever before us, Congressman Jared Huffman, who represents the 2nd District. Congressman Huffman is on the Committee of Natural Resources and the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. He was elected first in 2012. Prior to that, Mr. Huffman served in the Assembly, and he was a legislator who was known to take on complex, difficult issues and work in the public policy forum in a bipartisan manner in order to find solutions to the problems that we face in California. He also was the senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and one of his things that he helped forge was the restoration of the 153-mile stretch of the San Joaquin River in the California Central Valley. He also had served 12 years on the local government as a director of the Marin Municipal Water District from 1994 to 2006. Something that's not in his bio, but I know about, is that I guess it is on the back page. He went to UC Santa Barbara and was a star volleyball player. And you can see when he gets up here why he was playing volleyball. I'd like to welcome Congressman Huffman.
Terrific. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you. I'm glad I get to speak before that post-lunch sleepiness starts to set in. I want to thank John Coleman for inviting me on behalf of this coalition to speak. John is, of course, not only your CEO here at the Bay Planning Coalition, but he's also president of ACWA, the Association of California Water Agencies, and he serves on the board of East Bay Mud. So clearly, this man needs a hobby. Maybe he has one, and you're part of it. At any rate, I am honored to be here. So many community leaders, industry leaders around this room. Honored to follow my good friend and colleague John Garamendi, who is a leading voice in the Congress for ports and transportation infrastructure, also on water management, and of course his signature Build It in America initiative for middle-class jobs is something that I'm very supportive of and excited about. It does occur to me that perhaps John Garamendi and I should bottle whatever it is the folks in this room have been drinking for the past few decades, whatever has made you so collaborative and effective, and take it back to Washington where it is sorely needed. The people and the groups in this room, working together with partners like BCDC, the Army Corps, various local governments, have improved our region's quality of life and our economy while actually enhancing our bay and its environmental values. Over the last 50 years, this coalition, I think, has been a real success story. Our region, of course, has the first coastal zone management agency, which is a model that allows federal agencies and state and local governments to work across jurisdictional lines with a broad array of stakeholders to get things done and to manage coastal resources. That's the key to places like San Francisco Bay, which touches so many different jurisdictions, 9 different counties, and requires an unbelievable amount of coordination in a diverse region. But we constantly reap the benefits of that coordination and planning in our quality of life, in the movement of goods, in our healthy environment, and in our booming tourism economy. So thank you for what you do. Over the past 20 years in different capacities, whether as a local water district director or as a state assemblyman where I got to chair the water committee, now as a member of Congress, I've had a chance to work with you on all sorts of different things. And the district that I represent now stretches from Marin County in the south all the way up the coast of California to the Oregon border. When I describe it to my colleagues in Washington, there's something in that description for each of them to be jealous about, I think. I mean, I have the Golden Gate Bridge, I have San Francisco Bay, I have 1/3 of our amazing California coast, a world-class wine region, parks filled with ancient redwoods, amazing rivers and salmon, and 65% of the marijuana produced in America in my district. So, if you can't identify with something in that list of things in my district, you're just not trying. But we also, in the 2nd Congressional District, have an intricate series of challenges involving water and infrastructure, and I'm excited to be in a position where I hope I can really focus on these issues in the United States Congress. This is the first time I've had a chance to meet with many of you as the ranking member of the new subcommittee in the Natural Resources Committee on water, power, and oceans. And so that's a committee with jurisdiction over the Bureau of Reclamation, over fisheries, over hydropower, and other important water resource issues that are critical to California and to my district. I've also joined Mr. Garamendi and actually a half-dozen California members on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for this Congress, and I'm excited about that. So like many of you, I am deeply becoming engaged in the work of the Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, the Coast Guard, and the many federal laws relating to water, transportation, and infrastructure. And I approach this work from a premise that terms like sustainability, a strong economy, and environmental protection are not only compatible, they're actually interdependent. I think that's a premise that's been validated by the work of this coalition over the years, but unfortunately, many of my colleagues in the Congress see things as a series of competing choices in a zero-sum game, and I think we need to change that. We need to educate Congress about the work that's been accomplished here, how the San Francisco Bay Area makes long-term plans that balance economic growth with environmental protection, how we invest in the future, and how we reap the benefits of that approach. It's not utopia that we've created here, but I do think that we are experiencing a better future right now because of the vision of those who initiated this coalition and BCDC many years ago. And it could be the path to a better future for our entire country, instead of the conflict and the false choices and the stubborn ideology that is holding back progress in our nation's capital. Now, we're also experiencing a future which, at least in one respect, is more daunting than anything the prior generations of planners could have imagined, because the current drought is showing us what climate change really means, and it is not pretty. Earlier this year, scientists from NASA, Columbia University, and Cornell published a study warning us that the West and the Southwest likely will be hit with mega droughts that could linger for decades. And if the current pace of climate change continues unabated, in fact, we may already be in one of those mega droughts. So our relationship with water in the arid West is definitely changing, and how we deal with the current drought may well shape the future of the entire American West. What can we do? Well, this takes regional cooperation and planning on a grand scale. Pat Mulroy, who's the former general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority that includes Las Vegas, and now a senior fellow of climate adaptation and environmental policy at Brookings, said this at a recent California Water Policy Conference. She said, "We are citizens of a single watershed. We created it. It is a man-made watershed. It crosses the Continental Divide. It connects us to the Rio. It crosses over the Wasatch Front. It goes into central Arizona. And every one of us doesn't have rights. We have responsibilities at this point. It is Southern Nevada's responsibility to conserve. It is California's responsibility to conserve." And I like the way she's looking at this challenge. Clearly, we can only meet it if we plan and invest and work together like this coalition has done for the San Francisco Bay region for a long time. So how are we doing? Well, at the state level, I'm happy to say we're beginning to step up. Governor Brown signed a $1 billion spending plan into law recently on top of the water bond that was passed last year. And that new emergency funding includes $267 million in grants to water recycling projects and also to expand drinking water supplies in small and poor communities. $75 million in immediate drought relief for certain communities, $660 million for flood protection projects that will provide multiple benefits. And the state is also providing key leadership in setting restrictions on water use. You saw the headlines last week. Governor Brown is starting to exercise his emergency authority with mandatory restrictions for most categories of water use throughout the state. So we're seeing things like a requirement to replace 50 million square feet of lawns with drought-tolerant landscaping in partnership with local governments, creating a temporary statewide consumer rebate program to retrofit appliances in a way that will save a lot of water and energy. Requirements for campuses, golf courses, cemeteries, and other large landscapes to make significant cuts in their water use, and requirements for water-efficient drip irrigation system for landscaping with new construction. Now, things like this elicit yawns from people like John Coleman and others who have worked with Bay Area water districts who've been doing this kind of stuff for a long, long time. But it's important to remember that we have a huge state, and there are water districts in Sacramento and Fresno, for example, who are just starting to figure out how to use their fancy new water meters. Imagine that, a device that can actually measure water use. And if you use it correctly, you can actually bill people volumetrically for the water they use instead of a flat fee that allows them to use as much as they want. So there's a real disparity in the evolution of water conservation programs around this state. And to some parts of the state, these new initiatives by Governor Brown are going to feel pretty revolutionary. If we meet these goals that the governor has set, we could save 1.5 million acre feet of water. So that sounds like a lot, and it's certainly good, but I want to emphasize that it's not enough. It's not nearly enough. We can do, and we need to do a lot more, and to do that, it would be nice if Congress would step up and be a constructive partner with California and other western states. I am working on a bill that will help us do just that, to speed funding for water reuse and recycling, for desalination, to improve the management of federal reservoirs, to provide incentives for smart forest and watershed management. And if we do some of these cutting-edge strategies in our watersheds, we can actually improve water quality and yield while making them more resilient and resistant to catastrophic wildfires. But even if we do all these things, even if the state continues pouring money into the problem, setting new regulations and requirements, and we have a constructive contribution from Congress, it's still not enough. You've seen the numbers. In January, our statewide consumption fell 9% year over year. In February, we actually slid backward and only fell a couple of percentage points year over year. And meanwhile, our water supply is down much, much further than those reductions in demand that we've been able to achieve. Our snowpack was recently measured at the lowest point in recorded history. Our reservoirs are about 46% of capacity. That's a little better than we were last year, but it's still a very ominous statistic as we head into what we know will be a long, dry, hot summer, and we know that there's not much more runoff coming from the snowpack because it's simply not there. Now here's the kicker. Governor Brown's dramatic water restrictions, the modest levels of conservation we've been achieving so far from residential and commercial users, and the goal of saving 1.5 million acre feet, all of that is focused on about 20% of the actual water use in California. Now, you've heard the famous line from the bank robber Willie Sutton when he was asked why he robbed banks. He said, because that's where the money is. Okay, well, you can't talk seriously about California's drought and how we're going to get through it without acknowledging that 80% of our water supply goes to agriculture, and most of it in the Central Valley. Central Valley ag is to water what banks are to money. It's where almost all of it is. Now, it's a different story when we look at what's happening in urban areas with residential and commercial users, and then we contrast that with what's going on in Central Valley agriculture with the big growers. None of Governor Brown's proposed water restrictions apply in that situation, and it is true that state water project and federal water project customers through the Central Valley Project have seen major reductions in their water deliveries from those projects. That is pursuant to shortage provisions in their contracts, but many large irrigators in the Central Valley have received close to full deliveries, and many have bought and sold replacement supplies to make up for the shortfall in deliveries from the state and federal projects, and many more, perhaps most, have simply turned up their groundwater pumps and replaced those surface water supplies with groundwater extraction, creating one of the worst groundfall overdraft situations we've seen in the history of California, causing a massive subsidence problem in parts of the San Joaquin Valley and the Tulare Basin that is threatening public infrastructure and which could have permanent adverse effects on the ability of our aquifers to actually store water. That's a big deal in a state like California where groundwater storage is about 40% of our water supply. When you talk about permanently losing the ability to store water in that aquifer, we should be alarmed. Now remember that the state and the federal water projects were built in large part to rescue these regions from massive groundwater overdrafting in the early part of the last century. And now, even with the infusion of massive replacement supplies from state and federal projects, we're back in a situation of massive groundwater overdraft and crisis. So there is something unsustainable happening in terms of Central Valley agricultural water use. We do need to talk about it, and we're not going to get through this drought if we don't, let alone getting through mega droughts in the future that may be the new normal. Now, thankfully, the state of California has begun to step up, and they took an important step last year with historic groundwater reform legislation. California is no longer the only Western state that doesn't have a state groundwater management policy. But the step that we have taken is going to take about 25 years to fully implement, and I hope that we still have groundwater resources to manage by the time all of that kicks in. Meanwhile, big growers in the valley are continuing to make risky business decisions that are making our water problems worse, and we need to confront this. According to the California Department of Agriculture, during this critical drought, an additional 70,000 acres of almonds, or 8.3 million almond trees, were planted. Almond acreage has nearly doubled in the last 15 years. And why is this a problem? Well, first, it hardens agricultural water demand. These are permanent trees with long-term water needs. They can't be fallowed in times of shortage. Now, there are certainly places in California where it makes sense to grow them and where they should be grown. Places where there are abundant and reliable surface supplies, where groundwater resources are not in overdraft conditions, where there aren't interruptible supply contracts from state and federal projects. But in regions where there are these interruptible supply projects, where there is groundwater overdraft, and where there's not replacement supplies readily available, continuing to expand the acreage of these permanent crops and these very thirsty ones in the case of almonds, 1 gallon of water to produce a single almond, it's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for disaster, and it's a huge amount of water that we're talking about. 10% of California's water supply now goes to almonds alone. That's more water than is consumed by San Francisco and Los Angeles combined. So, while we focus on more and more restrictions from the relatively small share of water consumption in urban areas, there has to be a similar effort given to addressing these Central Valley water use issues as we head into year 4 of a critical drought. And I don't want to just pick on Governor Brown or anyone else. The truth is the federal government has really missed its opportunity to lead on this. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation is the nation's largest water wholesaler, and yet it doesn't even collect data on how much federally subsidized water they're delivering to different types of crops in different regions. They don't even know what the water is used for or how much is going to any particular crop. Now, I get the politics of this. I get the fact that asking hard questions of the largest water users in California, who have never been asked questions like this before, is going to be tough. But let's be clear. None of your businesses, none of your communities has gotten a pass in this drought, and you're not going to get a pass. So we need to all be in this together. Let's also be clear this is not a choice between our environmental laws and the availability of fruits and vegetables for American families, as some would have us believe. 70% of California's almonds are exported to places like China. The almond market has been booming. It hit $4.8 billion in 2012. That's triple what it was just in 2002, and that's why huge institutional investors like TIAA-CREF and others are pouring money into nut farms as we export more and more nuts to meet the ever-increasing demand in Asia. Now, this is great business for some people, and that can be a good thing, all right? But what happens when it begins to threaten to crash our state's water supply? At some point, these cropping decisions are gambling with the bigger California economy, and certainly with our public water resources, in particular our groundwater, and with public infrastructure that taxpayers will have to repair when it's damaged by subsidence, and with the Bay Delta ecosystem, and with the coastal economy that is so important to everyone in this room and certainly to everyone in my district. So as we confront this terrible drought and the prospect of mega droughts, we have to think about the kind of state we live in. Now, I have a colleague on the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. McClintock, who has started to argue that we should convene what's known as the God Squad under the Endangered Species Act. And this is a high-level group of top officials who can single out species to simply go extinct, to basically stop protecting them under our Endangered Species Act. And some Central Valley leaders want us to do that, not only for key indicator species like the Delta smelt, but also for our iconic, our historic, our culturally significant, and our commercially valuable salmon runs in California. Also, that a little bit more water could be delivered through the state and federal projects. And I say that before we ask our ecosystem and our salmon runs to take one for the team and go extinct, I think we should at least start asking some hard questions about where the vast majority of water in the state of California is being used and how it's being used. Now, obviously, I spend a lot of time thinking about water. You shouldn't have got me started on water. Hard to get me stopped. But I am glad to report that there are some other issues that I think we're doing actually a better job of protecting and investing in shared resources. Last year, Congress passed WRDA, a bill that I hope is going to lead to more regular dredging for ports and harbors. That's a huge deal for me in my district. I've got smaller ports and harbors. Some of you in this room are concerned with much bigger ports and harbors, but we are all in it together when it comes to the need to keep them open and keep the goods and the recreational interests and others moving in and out of these critical facilities. The bill moved toward, I think, took an important step towards ensuring that California receives a more fair share of funding as well. And we're beginning to take steps, since we're talking now about the jurisdiction of the Army Corps of Engineers, toward bringing their operations of water facilities and dams in California into the 21st century. I have a bill called the Forecast Act, which is directing the Corps of Engineers to do something they've never done. When they decide when to release water from dams, like Lake Mendocino in my district, they look at historic hydrology. They have binders of data that tell them that in early April, the probability of a major storm is such and such, and therefore they need to reserve X amount of acre-feet of flood storage capacity in their reservoir to protect boats from flooding. It's a backward look at hydrology. It is not an upward look at satellites and weather planes that can actually tell us whether a storm is coming. We've come a long way since the 1950s when these rule curves were put together, and yet it's going to take an act of Congress to allow the Corps of Engineers to incorporate modern science and modern weather data into these critical decisions that can make the difference between hundreds of thousands of acre-feet in any given year being available for the state of California. So I've got a bill that I think makes a lot of sense. We're going to keep moving that through the T&I committee, and I hope it will be very bipartisan. And the other big thing, I heard Mr. Garamendi refer to it, so I'll just end with my 2 cents on the subject of surface transportation. We have less than 60 days now to address the fact that our Highway Trust Fund is going to go broke once again. You all have become very familiar with this fire drill. We have a structural deficit in our funding of transportation. California depends on the Highway Trust Fund for about 48% of our transportation infrastructure and public transit operating needs. So it's a big deal when we talk about the insolvency of that, and every year we seem to find some gimmick or some Band-Aid to keep it going for a little while longer. The problem is we haven't raised the gas tax since 1993, and you know what's happened since 1993. We're a bigger country, we have more transportation infrastructure needs. We also are using less gasoline. We've become more fuel efficient. We're beginning to have a new mix in our transportation fuels. So something's got to give. We got to either raise the gas tax or do what the president has proposed and do a broader piece of tax reform that includes some funding for our transportation infrastructure. And then over the long term, I think we're going to also have to confront the fact that the gas tax is probably not the long-term funding mechanism we need, given the changes we're experiencing in transportation and the new types of fuels, electrifications, and fuel cells. So I've introduced a bill to get the discussion of the long-term solution going. It would be a carbon tax on all types of transportation fuels, having EPA do a life cycle analysis, much like CARB has done here in the state of California. There are other ideas. Some people prefer a vehicle miles traveled approach. Some people prefer some kind of a per barrel oil tax. There are lots of ways to do this, but in the next 60 days, we got to come up with one because we can't afford to allow this trust fund to go insolvent. And I want you to know I'm committed to making that happen. I will support anything that keeps this fund solvent as we continue to talk about longer term solutions, which I hope to talk with all of you in this room about in the months and years ahead. So thanks so much for your leadership. Thanks very much for having me. And I'm going to take the good, successful collaborative model that you have established here in the Bay Area with me back to Washington and see if we can get them working in the same mode. Thank you.
He is the president of ENS Resources. He's a recognized leader in environmental protection and innovative government policies. He had worked for EPA, representing them before Congress, and also had received 2 special achievement awards recognized for his superior work to help ensure the passage of the Superfund Act in the '96 Congress. Eric is also a member of the Bay Planning Coalition and works with us when Larry Goldspan and I had to go back to D.C. on WRDA, both in 2014 and 2013. Eric's office was the one who helped facilitate that. So basically he does consulting work, pro bono I might add, for the Bay Planning Coalition, and he's also a personal friend. So please welcome Eric Saperstein.
Well, thank you, John, and bear with me for 1 second as I try and get this up. Okay, so as the saying goes, now for something completely different. I was going to give you a Washington update, and then I saw the schedule with Congressman Garamendi and Congressman Huffman and said, well, I'll change it up a little bit because they're going to give you sort of an update. I think you just heard it. I do want to say one thing. Whether you agree or disagree with specific elements of their presentations, what the takeaway is that these two gentlemen are trying to make change in Washington and giving solutions to folks to debate, and that's the most important thing when you talk about gridlock and what have you. So I think that needs to be understood and applauded. Okay, so I want to talk today about the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, 2 R's, WRDA. It's a pleasure to say that because of this coalition and other stakeholders, as well as the Corps of Engineers in Congress, we now have this bill, 1 year almost this June, in place and being implemented. And as I say, there's a lot of credit that goes around, but particularly with the Corps of Engineers. You know, the Corps gets a lot of criticisms along the way because it's a tough organization to work with. It's got rules and procedures and what have you. But the Corps worked diligently with Congress to make certain that what was being done with WRDA was acceptable to the administration. And in the final analysis, we got the bill signed into law by record numbers of passage in both the House and the Senate. And that's a great thing because it means that the next process will probably be equally productive on WRDA. And that's going to happen next session when Congress takes up how to review the current law and move it forward. So I also, though, want to say that we need to recognize that the members of the California delegation that sit on the T&I committee, Transportation Infrastructure Committee, Congressman Huffman, Congressman Garamendi, Congresswoman Mimi Walters, Jeff Denham, and Senator Dianne Feinstein and Boxer in the Senate. These members worked hard for California's interests, and it came through in the end in WRDA, so they need to be acknowledged. Okay, so today I have both good news and bad news. The good news is we do have a WRDA. The bad news, we have to implement it because this WRDA is very new in the sense of what it's trying to do. It's trying to address the needs of the 21st century. So before we go into what's going on, let me sort of tell you that it's not all good, it's not all bad, but some of the good things. First of all, because of the coalition and others, we have enhanced dredging opportunities in the WRDA bill and the beneficial reuse of those dredge materials. We also have expanded port and dredging activities. And then from a second point of view, we have the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund with, well, a convoluted process, a mandate by the authorizers that the trust fund be used for its purposes and not husband in the general treasury to offset the deficit. We'll see how that translates in implementation. Right now, the administration is asking for a little bit more money out of the trust fund this coming cycle to deal with the needs of the infrastructure of the ports and harbors and inland waterways. We'll see what Congress does. My guess is when they finish appropriating, there'll be more money used in the trust fund than what we expected. Third, we have directives to study the future needs, and specifically infrastructure restoration, climate change, impacts that have to be addressed if we're going to deal with the future needs of our ports and harbors. And then fourth, and perhaps one of the most important elements of WRDA, is streamlining, regulatory streamlining. Whether it's through specific permit deadlines that have to be adhered to, or whether it's a function of, say, translating the importance of getting a project done efficiently through a non-federal sponsor, assuming more of the responsibilities, or contributing funds to the Corps to get the work done. This is a result of the WRDA rewrite. And we'll see again whether or not the implementation is as hoped for by Congress, but that's going to be in the next couple of months. We'll see how that rolls out over the next year. The next session of Congress, they'll be looking at that. And I might add also that there are penalties in this bill for failure to adhere to the deadlines for the Corps' budget. So those are just a few of the big issues that came about as a result of the WRDA bill. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that as much as we're looking at the future and what the needs are, in many respects, WRDA represents the challenges that are faced using new processes, if you will. Public Law 113-121, which is the formal name of WRDA for statutory purposes, essentially puts in place a new reform process with the hope that that new reform process will deliver outcomes, i.e. efficient delivery of projects. We'll see what happens. But I do think, when you think about it, because WRDA is an evolving process, and it always has been and will be, that when you look at what's going to take place, we're really talking about taking apart the pieces of the puzzle, if you will, and then trying to figure out how to put them back together. And that's what's going on right now. And when we reassemble these pieces, I think you're going to have a new an awakening at how to get things done for the 21st century needs. So what we have to do now is figure out where are we today and what does that bode for the future. Okay, so if you buy the logic that the process delivers outcomes, the question is, what did Congress intend in this bill, this now law? The second thing is, does it address the needs of the stakeholders? And how do we gauge that? Well, first of all, I'm using as an example the most recent and probably the easiest part of the process that's being implemented, and that's a report to Congress by the Corps of Engineers to deal with feasibility studies and project modifications. As you all know painfully, WRDA is sort of hamstrung by Congress's questionable actions to get rid of earmark bans in 2010. WRDA has always been a law, a program that depended on the identification of projects. That has been stymied by the efforts to eliminate earmarks. So what Congress did was it put this new process in place to do a study every year. And that study, the Corps has to collect project requests for feasibilities, project modifications that need to be made by non-federal interests, i.e. people like yourself. And that comes in every year, and then the Congress is supposed to get this report of the projects that are out there that should be considered for authorization. Failing such a report like this, Congress has to wait for the administration to ask for a project funding or project authorization through the budget process. So, what does this mean? And I want to use this as an example of what is or isn't happening as a case study for future implementation issues of other processes within WRDA that are really much more complicated than this. And it's sort of a good news, bad news story, if you will. So, if you accept the premise that without this study being a good study, or this report to Congress on prospective projects for funding authorizations, without that, we don't get really any real action in future WRDAs. So, the Corps put together its study as it was required. The challenge is, it was based on 5 criteria. And those criteria are pretty straightforward. You know, it has to be in the Corps' mission. It has to be authorized. It hasn't been a project or a study that hasn't been authorized prior times. And last, the project is doable within the Corps' authorities. Not necessarily a bad way to go. It sort of gives you a look at the world, if you will. Well, by analogy, this picture that you see up there, on the left is a picture of the universe of stars. Let's substitute the word stars for projects under WRDA. And it's pretty crowded. On the right is a picture taken at the same location by Hubble, when Hubble had what they called farsighted vision, and they had to go up and correct the lens because it wasn't getting a real picture of the areas that it was photographing. So you can see the difference. There's a lot of black areas in that picture that they thought was reality until they figured out that it was not the right vision. That's what we're faced with today with this study. The Corps has given a picture, if you will, of projects that are eligible for consideration by the Congress that is more like the picture on the right than a true representation of what the universe of opportunities are on the left. So why did that happen? It's really not the Corps' fault. They added a 6th criterion to the 5. And the 6th criterion was the project has the administration's approval. So this is a really serious implementation question, because what is going on is that the authority to make decisions is being further concentrated in the executive office of the president, and more specifically within the Office of Management and Budget. Those are the green eye shade guys in DC, and those folks make and break decisions on a policy level for the federal agencies. So you have this situation where Congress needs to know what the elements are that should be looked at so they can authorize those projects they wish to authorize. What has happened in this process is that the Corps has sent up a list of projects. In this case, 19 projects were identified as, shall we say, eligible for congressional consideration. 95 projects were considered ineligible for a whole host of reasons, some legitimate, some I throw in sort of the questionable category. But what you need to understand is there's a whole lot of projects out there, more than 19, I would argue, that probably could be submitted to Congress. The second thing I would argue, and more important, is the fact that the Corps and the administration were never tasked with telling Congress what they thought should be approved. They were tasked with identifying the universe, that picture on the left, of projects that can be considered by Congress and to allow Congress to make its determinations of which projects should be authorized and then subsequently funded. So what we have is a little bit of an awkward situation for Congress. The intent is not being implemented as they see fit. And then you have to ask yourself, if this is the easy stuff that's getting done, what's going to happen with the really difficult stuff when we talk about implementing the very innovative approaches to dealing with our water infrastructure needs under WRDA? So what do we do going forward? I mentioned that this group was very influential in going back to Washington and talking to the delegation on the needs, beneficial reuse of dredge materials, what have you, continued and expanded use of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for California. So going forward, here's the thing. You can't stop the advocacy. You need to approve the prospects for the effective outcomes that we need in this WRDA implementation process in the next year and a half's time. And how that's going to get done is if you articulate, advocate your fundamental expectations for WRDA and what you thought was going to happen and what you needed to have happen in order to give Congress the information, to give the Congressman Huffman, Garamendi, Denham, et al. On the committee that represent California, the information to work with, irrespective of where they come from in California, because all these issues ultimately mean a successful future for California's water infrastructure needs. So the answer to the question is, what do? You need to work with members on the committee, work with the delegation at large to continue to communicate your needs. And when do you start that? You start that yesterday. I'll tell you why. April 22nd, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, of which Mr. Huffman and Garamendi sit on, will hold theoretically a hearing that will review the Corps' fiscal year 16 budget request. They will spend 30 seconds of 2 hours on that request, asking questions of the General of the Corps, General Bostic, and the Assistant Secretary, Joellen Darcy. After they're through with that deep look at the budget, they will then turn for the next hour and a half or whatever to talk about the failure of the Corps to adhere to the implementation expectations of Congress and of the committee. So what we need to do, what you need to do, is communicate to these folks before April 22nd and beyond what you want done with the implementation of WRDA, what you feel needs to be done, what's going well, what isn't going so well, so that they're armed with the information to ask the Corps and to communicate their concerns. And the reason ultimately this is important is the chairman, Bill Schuster, of the full committee, has made it clear that he will begin work on a successor WRDA this coming September in anticipation of putting a WRDA to the president before he leaves office in 2016. So as the dearly departed Mr. Spock would say, go forth, advocate, and then you will prosper. Thank you very much, and I'll end there.